I want to welcome everyone for everyone tuning in from across the United States and beyond. We have people from outside of the country as well here tonight, which is very exciting. My name is Donna Merrill, and I am president of the amazing board of directors that has grown the Pollinator Pathway from a small local initiative um, to one that is becoming a broad grassroots social movement of people like me and you who have decided to take things into their own hands um, and take on the responsibility for creating real change in our communities and the natural environment. The Pollinator Pathway's mission is to support, educate, and inspire people and communities to restore and connect habitat for pollinators and wildlife. But we are just as focused on opening the door for collaboration, friendship, and starting the conversation about biodiversity, the biodiversity crisis that we are facing. I know it can be scary to feel like there's not much we can do to maintain a world where animals and humans can survive, but in fact, we do know how to bring biodiversity and butterflies back to our communities, our balconies, and our backyards. And for this reason, I invite you to join us on the Pollinator Pathway. Our speaker tonight is Uli Lorimer. He's a member of the Pollinator Pathway Advisory Board, Director of Horticulture at the Native Plant Trust in Massachusetts, which was founded in 1900, making it the oldest plant conservation organization in the United States. He's a native of Delaware and a graduate of the University of Delaware with an honors degree in landscape horticulture. His impressive career includes positions at the National Arboretum, Wave Hill, and as curator of native plants at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. He now heads the Garden in the Woods at the Native Plant Trust. He is the Boston Globe's source for the Ask the Gardener column. And his latest book, The Northeast Native Plant Primer, leads with this statement by him. The decision to plant natives in the garden is one of the most important choices we can make. So I am honored to have him here tonight to speak to us, and please welcome Uli Lorimer.
Thank you, Donna. Before I share my screen, also just wanted to thank Jenna and Donna for inviting me and making this opportunity a reality. And also to thank our support team of Elise and Louise, who are working behind the scenes to make sure this event goes smoothly. I'm just going to share my screen here. So, thank you all for everyone for joining this evening. And I understand we have a national and international crowd, and that's really exciting. I wanted to start off with just a few words around what Native Plant Trust is before launching into the topic here, which is to really take a little bit of a deeper dive into ecological horticulture. So, starting with what we are, as Donna mentioned, we are the nation's first plant conservation organization and the only one that's solely focused on New England's native plants. Our mission is to conserve and promote New England's native plants to ensure healthy, biologically diverse landscapes. And to achieve this, we sit on what I would call a three-legged stool, or three pillars that are in support of those missions, encompassing plant conservation, horticulture, and public programs. As you can see, we do quite a lot of things for the size of our organization. Starting with public programs, we offer a number of certificates. We've got over 200 online courses, and we stage events and symposia and field courses every year. In the center, the horticulture that I'm mostly responsible and involved with is the daily operations of Garden in the Woods, which is a 45-acre botanic garden, Nasami Farm and Nursery, which is located out in Western Massachusetts, where we grow native plants for sale. We grow them for restoration contracts. We grow them for display, at the garden, and we also execute rare plant conservation. We have a seed bank that's located out there. We're launching a relatively new program called Restoration Accelerator that is going to be building a regional seed partnership focused in Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire. And that's part of the Northeast Native Seed Network, which is an alliance of regional partnerships that span from Virginia all the way into Maine and Canada. In addition to all of those activities, there's publications, Garden Plant Finder that I'll talk about a little bit more, and plant sales. And finally, which has been our bread and butter for the longest time, has been plant conservation. We started the New England Plant Conservation Program, or NEPCOP, in 1990 as a way to convene all of the states of New England's conservation efforts across state lines. Rare plants and common plants, for that matter, don't really care or recognize our political boundaries. So the trouble is that plant conservation is defined by state boundaries, and rankings of what's rare and what's not are all determined upon whether or not plants exist within the boundaries of the state. So it made sense for us to have a program where on an annual basis, we get together with all of the natural heritage programs, the federal and state entities, contract botanists, everybody to share successes from the field work of the previous season and to jointly set conservation priorities, because we achieve far greater outcomes in collaboration than one in any single organization can do on their own. To further this, we have trained to date since 1990 over 1,500 plant conservation volunteers. So this is also a citizen science program that assists in monitoring, collecting data, and where appropriate, collecting seed of rare plant occurrences across the 6 states of New England. The result of this has been a rare plant seed arc. So we have about 75% of all of the 389 taxa of most conservation concern banked in our facility. And that really allows us to do some really wonderful plant conservation work. In addition to that, we publish floras, we publish a lot of papers about plant conservation. I want to start with just 3 examples of the power of this program and why seed banks and why plant conservation work is incredibly important. And even more so today than perhaps traditionally, where our approach was more species specific. And nowadays you get far more greater conservation and positive conservation outcomes by conserving entire habitats than single species. And so that really brings in the need for a lot of knowledge and expertise in growing common plants and how they fit into plant communities and plant ecologies. So our first example is a plant that we've been working with since 1989. This is a federally listed narrow endemic. So this plant, Jessop's milkvetch, only exists in 3 populations along the Connecticut River. We have been monitoring, collecting seeds, growing them, and augmenting these populations annually since that time. And as this is a species that grows in the rock crevices on the banks of the river and relies on ice scour to make sure that competition remains low, as we've seen a shift in our precipitation patterns to more intense summer rainstorms and summer flooding, we've seen some unfortunately negative impacts to this plant getting flooded out during its growing season when it should be flowering and making seed. Next, we have another success story. This is another federally listed plant, American chaff seed. Massachusetts represents the northern range limit for this plant. It hadn't been seen since 1965 until in 2018. A very large population of this was discovered by one of our plant conservation volunteers. And this new location, as you can read, has over 10,000 plants, which is really exciting. Lastly, the power of the seed bank. We were able to successfully grow sundial lupin from seed that was collected in Vermont in 1992 and sat in our seed bank for nearly 30 or more than 30 years. until we got a contract from the Natural Heritage Program to produce plants and reintroduce those back to former locations in the state of Vermont. So these are all really powerful examples of why fieldwork is important, why seed banks are important, and why trying to preserve genetic diversity is as important as possible. So I'm going to pivot now to talk about ecological horticulture. And I really love starting off my presentations with this picture because it is a great visual for so many things. Quite literally, our footprint on the landscape. And the question you see is a little bit of a rhetorical question, but it's one that I believe that there aren't any places left on this planet, this beautiful, wonderful, diverse planet of ours, that haven't been directly or indirectly influenced by the activities of humans. And yet, in this picture, there are hopeful notes. There are native plants that are still surviving underneath of this sneaker. And what I really love is that given enough time, nature will heal and it will reclaim itself. And the lichens and the moss that are slowly eating the leather of the shoe, for me, offer a little bit of a hopeful note in that with enough time and with enough intention, and increasingly with a little bit more help from us, nature will be able to heal. And I think that's one of the more powerful things about the native plant movement. So I'm going to start with some of the bad news, which is to say that in the United States, since the onset of European colonization, we have transformed a spectacularly large amount of vegetation that was formerly native vegetation into other things. Developed areas, lawns, or landscaped areas that were landscaped primarily with plants from other parts of the world. In context, that's all of the national parks and state parks put together. And lawns themselves, 12 million hectares. It's nearly the entire state of Pennsylvania. If you can imagine all of Pennsylvania being one contiguous lawn, that's about what we have here. And lawns I think, are an easy target here also to be able to think about how much water and pesticides and fossil fuels are used in pursuit of what people essentially think of as a green carpet, and that's ecologically not particularly diverse. As you can read below, all of that change has had some negative effects, not only on insects, but also on birds, on spiders, reptiles, fungi. Nearly all of our terrestrial songbirds, no matter where you are in this beautiful country of ours, need insects to be reproductively successful. And no other groups of plants will provide just the sheer breadth and quantity and abundance of insect species than ones that they co-evolved with. We're at this moment now where it's very obvious that gardeners need ecological horticulture. And so these are some of the driving reasons for it. I think first and foremost, there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of anxiety, a lot of what you might even consider climate trauma around what is happening. And we don't know what used to be predictable cycles and seasons are now becoming less predictable. We have an almost impossible task ahead of us with ecologically harmful species. And I'm saying this very, very pointedly to not call them invasive, because it's militaristic language. We hear enough about other kinds of invasions these days, and it's oftentimes a justification for really spreading poisons and other equally ecologically harmful practices in an attempt to eradicate them. So because of all these changes and the loss of habitat and the loss of connected habitat and the fragmentation of it, we're losing this abundance of wildlife. We're losing biodiversity. Really, anyone who's been in any area of the country here knows over time that there's this kind of perceived decrease in wild areas. And I want to say that as someone who grew up on the East Coast, this might feel a little bit different than somebody who's used to the large expanses of land that are in the west part of the United States, where this might not be particularly as apparent. There is a movement around wanting to preserve regional character. We have inherited a great deal of natural heritage and cultural heritage in this country, and there's a reason why Massachusetts looks different from Georgia, looks different from Texas, looks different from Oregon, for example, and it has a lot to do with the plants that make up the landscape there. But perhaps the most powerful motivator to adopt this approach, to welcome more native plants into your gardens, has to do with this desire to make a positive change. And that desire is informed by a hopefulness of a future where we can coexist together with nature, and a hope for a vision that encompasses humans and all forms of life in a really forward-thinking way. The other incredibly important thing here is that despite the enormity of the challenges that face us with climate change, with ecologically harmful plants and harmful species, your choices that you make in your garden are yours. So there's a degree of agency that you're afforded in being able to make those choices. And as Donna said, deciding to welcome a native plant could quite possibly be one of the most important decisions that you can make. And so both hope and agency are really, really powerful motivators to, in the very least, learn more about the approach if you aren't already on the journey towards welcoming more native plants. This is a reason why you should get started. And really what it boils down to, as I say in the last bullet here, is that nature needs our help, and we can become backyard conservationists to help fulfill the dream of the pollinator pathways, which is connected corridors of wildlife, of plant material, of floral resources and plant-based resources that allow the wildlife that we want to see in our gardens to move around and move freely and move through the landscape. So I'm going to pivot for just a minute here and talk about diversity, and I want to introduce another kind of a concept here, which is around abundance. We think of biodiversity as a quantitative way of assessing how many different things are in a given space and at any given time. So looking at this scene here for Maine, I can put on my botanist hat and say there's 275 species of vascular plants here. We'll add on top of that the insects and the birds and the fungi and all these different forms of life, and you have a snapshot of how diverse it is. But what it doesn't tell you in any way is how relatively abundant any single one of those things are. And each and every one of those organisms has an evolutionary trajectory and a desire to be able to pass on the right adaptations to be able to survive. And so if there aren't enough individuals to be able to do it, that's problematic for these plants and for these species. So the idea here as it relates to gardens is to not only embrace species diversity in your gardens, as many different kinds, because we need different kinds of flowers for different kinds of insects, and different kinds of host plants for caterpillars to become moths and butterflies. But it's also a call to plant as abundantly as possible. If you go out into nature, do you see plants equally spaced in a straight line that don't touch each other? No. Are they swimming in a mulch sea that ties everything together? No. Plant communities are intimate. They grow together in a really beautiful way. The plants interact with one another. They touch each other. Their roots intertwine. They live together in plant communities. And this is the basis for the approach of ecological horticulture that you can replicate quite easily in your own space. So This approach I like to call regionalism. So it doesn't really matter if you're gardening in the Northeast, if you're in the Great Lakes, if you're in the Southeast, if you're in the Pacific Northwest, if you're creating ecologically functional gardens in the Sonoran Desert in Arizona, the conceptual framework remains the same. You want to use regionally appropriate plants. You want to capture and value local adaptation as much as possible. And you want to build those relationships with the plants themselves inherently support a wide variety of ecological relationships, many that we might not even be aware of, even though we tend to focus on bees and wasps and pollinators and butterflies and so forth because they're very visible. So this is an approach that is replicable. You can model it anywhere you go and repeat and have similar results. Because what is happening in terms of the threats, the fragmentation is not unique to the Northeast United States. It's happening all over the country. And I would argue all over developed places that are losing diversity in favor of development. Now, this approach is not simply take a step back, let's neglect things and see what happens. I love the idea of no mow May, but I also find it performative. I think it's wonderful as a way that as a campaign to help folks realize that lawns are an extension of your garden, and you can do things that allow the functionality and utility of a garden space. I have two little boys, for example. They need a space to run. But my yard and my garden does not need to look like a putting green. It can be full of other plants. It can be diverse. So simply not mowing anymore isn't going to result in the meadow that I think is hiding underneath of the lawnmower blades. This is not a novel ecosystem, which is a convenient justification in saying we will accept the presence of ecologically harmful species and assemblages in our landscapes because they're performing services for us. So yes, a marsh that's full of Phragmites, for example, is holding soil together and it's filtering water, but it's nowhere near as diverse as a cattail marsh, for example. And the trouble is that these ecologically harmful species don't just stay in one place. They spread and they reduce diversity over the long term. So I think this is a really important sort of conceptual framework as I talk about this, is that it's not just unique, even though a lot of my examples will be plants from my neck of the woods and my wheelhouse. It really is something that can be replicated anywhere you go. So we have a spectacularly diverse country. If you were to look at the amount of native plants to the United States that are available broadly in the nursery trade, it wouldn't come anywhere close to the actual diversity that's out on the landscape. I really love this map because it shows you the parts of the country where there are high areas of biodiversity and species diversity. Any areas you see in the blue and darker greens are areas where there's lots of diversity. Florida Panhandle, Sierra Nevadas, and what I find really interesting is actually the DC area and Maryland. So what are some of the untapped examples that are here? I love sedges, for example, not because sedges have the most beautiful flowers, far from it, but sedges are a spectacularly diverse group. In the Northeast, we've got 480 species that grow anywhere from standing water to pure sand. And I think of them as the sort of ecological fascia that pulls together and holds together ecological plant communities that allow for seasonal highlights to emerge and really draw your eye and get those pops of color and texture that we like to design them. Most folks understand why milkweeds are important because the campaign to save the monarch has been so incredibly successful. I was surprised to learn the center of diversity for milkweeds is actually in the desert Southwest. And so folks there have a great variety of amazing species to be able to work with and include in and to begin to create that connectivity for the monarchs as they go through their annual migration. Violets is another one of my favorite groups. Many folks think of these as only spring plants. Again, I think they fill in beautifully underneath and around. Broadly, centers of diversity in the Appalachians and the Northeast, and then again in the Pacific Northwest and Northern California. These are really wonderful plants. They're some of the earliest ones to flower, so they're providing those crucial resources. And many of them will actually make a second round of seed later on as an insurance policy to make sure that they can spread around. And lastly, trilliums, as one of the more iconic eastern woodland species. There are many, many different ones. Garden in the Woods happens to hold an accredited trillium collection at Garden in the Woods. So we're really interested in bringing these into cultivation and getting them more into the gardens of our visitors. Now, if we flip it around, we also have this map showing exotic vascular plant species. And so you can see where the parts of the country are that have the greatest densities of introduced ecologically harmful plants. Not all of them are ecologically harmful, but introduced plants. And I think this is also a really wonderful map that shows you ports of entry. Many of these species arrived here long before we were flying and globally shipping things around on planes. These are all mostly because of seaports and port areas that you can see Baltimore, New York, Boston, Miami, Chicago, San Francisco. These are all where most of these species get their foothold into our landscapes. So the way that Native Plant Trust defines nativity, as I said, has much more to do with, less to do with political boundaries and more to do with the boundaries of what are called ecoregions. And if you haven't been exposed to this concept, I would really highly recommend that you Google EPA ecoregions and have fun with the maps that are there. These are regions that were put together based on similarities of plant communities, geology, hydrology, soil types, and to some extent land uses. And it helps to inform how some plants are distributed on the landscape. And with knowledge of where your plants come from, you can choose and source your plants from within your ecoregion because it keeps that same local adaptation in place. Now, this is hard to do, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I'd like to start with some assumptions about this approach. And these are things that we generally take for granted, and we assume that they are true. And I'm going to go through these, and then I'm going to challenge those assumptions because this subject is complicated and it is complex. But I'm going to try to see if we can tease it apart and make it as accessible as possible. So first assumption here is that genetically diverse native plant species maintain more ecological relationships than cultivated plants do. The second one is an assumption that genetic diversity is crucial for plants to be able to adapt in an uncertain future. And I think that holds true as well. Preserving regional character begins with the use of regionally appropriate plants. Also seems like a fairly solid assumption to make. Knowing where your plant comes from helps drive decisions. And that, that's perhaps contextual, but we'll see. The last one, I think, is also one that people are beginning to understand, and it is one of the powerful things around Pollinator Pathway, is the recognition that gardens are connected to one another and to wild spaces at multiple scales, at local scales and at regional scales. And so the decisions that you make in your garden today will likely influence and impact those of your neighbors and the regional ecologies. So let's look at this a little bit more closely. Every plant has a wonderful story to tell about the ecological relationships that it maintains. This here is turtlehead. It produces these wonderful white flowers in the late spring or late summer and is really only successfully pollinated by bees that are muscular and big enough to be able to squeeze into those flowers, to prise the petals apart and access the floral resources inside. It also happens to be the sole, up until recently, the sole host plant for this beautiful butterfly called the Baltimore checker spot. And this plant, this beautiful organism, eating turtle head is not a preference. It's not like, well, I'll decide maybe today I'll eat it and I'll eat something else. It is actually a requirement for this species to survive. So there is something in the leaf chemistry of this particular plant that allows this gorgeous organism to go through its life cycle and become this beautiful adult. Up until very recently, this was the sole plant, although a friend of mine who's been raising caterpillars and moths and butterflies for a very long time recently told me that this species will now accept an introduced plant called narrowleaf plantain, which hails from Europe, as an alternate host. So what I think of this as perhaps a cautionary tale in that insects but not by their own choice, are also evolving to the novelties of our landscape now. But this is the original plant that this one wanted to eat, that this organism wants to eat. And so if you want to support Baltimore checker spots, you want to have the chance of seeing these beautiful organisms in your garden, you need to plant those plants. Without them, no Baltimore checker spots. There's no gray area in between. Pollination happens with a wide variety of organisms. And here, as an example of a vining clematis, I'm showing you the unattractive pollinators, the big nasty flies, spiders, cicada killers that are out there doing the same thing that the honeybees and the bumblebees and the butterflies are doing. But they're part of a plant community, a part of a community of organisms that are sustained by this one particular plant. And what all of that pollination does, it allows the plant to make these gorgeous, beautiful, fluffy seed heads that are then used by goldfinches in the springtime to line their nests. And I find that there's just so many wonderful sort of circles of relationships that all come back to the presence of this plant. If that plant isn't on the landscape, you're not drawing in the pollinators, and goldfinches might decide to go nest somewhere else. So relationships are sustained by these plants. A fun side project that we do at the garden, we raise giant silk moths. These are primarily nocturnal creatures. And the whole point of this is to really foster the connection between the host plant and the caterpillar itself. And because they're arboreal, because they're nocturnal, most people will never ever know that these are here on the landscape. And boy, are they just so amazed to see the adults when they emerge in May and June, and equally emerge to see the caterpillars as they're working their way through their host plants in the garden and on their way to becoming cocoons again. And here's some visuals. And those relationships don't just stop with insects. They extend all the way through with other groups. This is another reason, as I said earlier, the majority of our terrestrial songbirds need insects. There was a wonderful study done not too long ago that quantified this in the case of chickadees. If a pair of chickadees want to raise a successful brood, they're going to need between 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars in the spring, which is just a staggering amount of biomass. And no other groups are going to be able to support that amount than your native trees. So oaks, elms, maples, hickories, birches, those are all the real, what we would call keystone species, just because of the number of relationships that they sustain. So a garden that is species rich from an insect perspective offers more opportunities and more diverse opportunities to support a broader breadth of insects, which is a form of pollinator conservation. And that in turn passes on all of those other resources on up the food chain, plant-based food and shelter for your mammals, your birds, all the way up to your top predators. And it all comes back to this foundational group, which is plants and insects. And like I said, those relationships don't stop there. They include the world of amphibians, a little sampling of some of our amphibian and reptile friends that we have at the garden. And I'm convinced they're here in thriving populations because of the native plants that are there. Now, genetic diversity is really a wonderful thing. This odd-looking plant, for those who are not familiar, is called skunk cabbage. If you damage the leaf, it smells like a skunk. Um, but no two flowers are exactly the same. There is something really wonderful about the fact that each one is an individual. Each one has character, a different kind of swoop and swirl to the spath and the spadix. It's non-uniform, and all of that adaptation, all of that genetic diversity that's inherent in a large group of plants like this, make them best and better suited to adapt to an uncertain future. And that extends, of course, to other kinds of flowers. Here are some examples of lilies that you can see in a range of colors, these beautiful gentians that are found down in New Jersey. And that brings me to provenance. So the idea that knowing where something is from helps you to drive decision making. In art, we think of provenance as documentation, which lends a piece of art authenticity. In nature, an ecotype is a snapshot of a place at a time. So if you collect seed from one particular place at a particular time, it's a snapshot of that species' existence and its adaptation. Sometimes we think of that as being representative of the full breadth of range and variability in a plant. And we say that an ecotype is the straight species, but not to split hairs here, but the straight species doesn't really exist. There's a broad range from the northern range of its distribution all the way down to the southern range and everything in between. Another way to think of this is phenology, or growing degree days. So this is the average number of days above freezing. So if I were growing a red maple all the way in Bangor, Maine, that tree's got a little over 5 months to make flowers, get them wind pollinated, make leaves, go through their whole life cycle, disperse those trees before frost comes. That same red maple has nearly twice as much time to complete all of that all the way down in Charleston, and even more so down in Florida. And so if you were to source a red maple for a project, for example, that was grown at a tree farm in South Carolina and you didn't know and you planted it up in Bangor, Maine, that tree would have a hard time surviving, and its place in supporting wildlife is mismatched because of the timing. So there really is something important about local adaptation and about locally sourced plants, and that helps you drive those decision making. Lady Bird Johnson, of course, is a well-known figure in support of wildflowers and native plants. And I think you could insert your state's name here or your country's name here without losing the spirit of this statement. So now we're going to pivot again and talk about what are the challenges to those assumptions. Genetic diversity is an abstract concept. It's not something that you can see. You can't look at a plant and know anything inherently about whether it is genetically diverse or not. It's also hard sometimes to emphasize why it's important because it's an abstract concept. Availability of native seed is a bottleneck in some parts of the country, and maybe not necessarily in all. There's not enough research that either completely supports or refutes the claim that species are ecologically better than cultivars of meat. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit as well. And then from the nursery industry standpoint, the information that is provided by nurseries when you go to buy plants is lacking. There's certainly not a degree of transparency about how plants were grown. You're confronted with a lot of confusing and aggressive marketing. There's always new hot plants every year coming out. How are you to know that they're really any better than the ones before, or just slightly repackaged versions of things that were released earlier? And there's really not enough good resources for gardeners and designers to help drive those decision makings when we weigh all of these things together. So why is it hard to find natives? I was talking to Donna and Janet earlier before the webinar began that this is a big sort of disjunct for a lot of folks that get inspired by talks like this, want to go out there and do the right thing and welcome more native plants, and they just simply can't find them, or they're looking for specific things and they can't find them. And all that is available are cultivars and selections, which isn't necessarily or inherently a bad thing. So the total amount of nursery sales that native plants encompass in the United States right now is about a quarter. That has grown from 13% about 10 years ago. But the driving reasons for that is the availability of the species just isn't there. Consumer preferences are driving the what you have available and the nursery in a different direction. And there just simply isn't enough knowledge about native plants, how many they are, what they do. There's just not enough knowledge. You layer on top of that aggressive marketing, and we think we can all agree that the information that you get on a plant label is pretty bland and next to useless when making these kinds of decisions. So the nursery industry could do better. A survey of wholesale nurseries, and here it's important to note that the folks that landscape shopping centers and corporate parks and public spaces don't shop at retail places, they shop at wholesale nurseries. And so in the Mid-Atlantic region, and again, I don't have my finger on the pulse of the wholesale nursery industry in other parts of the country, but the results you can see here that about 3/4 of what they're offering were non-native ornamentals from somewhere else. And of the quarter that was considered native, it was a wide variety of some species, but a lot of cultivars and hybrids. And because of the way that the nursery industry works, many wholesalers are buying their plant material from people that sell liners and starts. And so the sort of custody of information from when it started, either as a cutting or a seedling, through to a wholesaler is broken and lost. And so nobody really seems to care about where things are from. Most interestingly, most studies show that consumers are willing to pay more for native plants as long as they're perceived as low maintenance. There is, I think, a really salacious rumor that says that native plant gardens are no maintenance. Every garden requires some degree of intervention and editing. And so even native plant gardens, what I will say is if you do your homework well and you site your plants properly, they're going to need less water during drought periods, certainly less fertilizer and less other kinds of help down the line. So there is less maintenance involved, but it's not no maintenance or low maintenance. The other interesting consumer preference is around flowering. So people really love extended flowering and like double flowers and compactness. The endless summer hydrangea that you see here looks fantastic at a distance, but if you zoom in a little bit closer, all of those beautiful blue flowers that you see are actually sterile florets. So they don't produce any nectar, they don't produce any pollen whatsoever. And in fact, the reproductive parts of this flower have been bred out of existence in favor of sterile florets that give the impression of being in flower for long, long periods of time, but they offer very little to any kind of pollinator that's out there. Disease resistance, I think, is a good thing. And so because the people that analyze this market understand that's what sells, many of the people who are developing new cultivars of native plants are taking their cues and saying, well, I need to grow something that has double flowers or that stays in bloom for a long time. I need bigger flowers than what Mother Nature evolved and created. And that's how we get into things like this. So this was created to be pretty. All right, this is a double flowered selection of a coneflower called hot papaya. As you can see, plant breeders now really love to release series. So there'll be a number of different ones in the confection series. But again, a double flowered plant where you've swapped out reproductive parts and floral resources for more petals is an ecological dead end. In order to make sure that all of these plants are uniform and the same, these plants likely have plant patents attached. And in order to attain and retain a plant patent, your plant has to be asexually propagated. It has to be grown from cuttings. So what is you telling me that I'm putting these out in large quantities, that they're less genetically diverse than something grown from seed? Here's another example. So let's say I didn't really know much about gardening, but I knew enough that bees like nectar and sugary flowers. And so I knew that that's great. And then I'm looking at the series, the Sugar Buzz series, and I'm looking at all these names, and they kind of feel like they belong more in a candy store than necessarily in a garden. And what are they really? All essentially exactly the same plants, about the same height, in slightly different colors of pink and red. What other information are they giving you here? Well, the origin of this plant is North America. So how are you going to apply the concepts of regionalism if all you get is North America? It's kind of useless. It says that it's bee friendly. Well, the United States has over 4,000 species of bees. Let's be a little bit more specific. Does it support specialist bees? Does it support generalist bees? I think if you want to make these decisions to preserve as much biodiversity as possible, you also have to know about what those relationships are that your plants sustain, and you're not given that information if this is what you're confronted with. Even more troubling, and I think that a lot of folks know, okay, well, I don't want to buy my plants from big box stores like Home Depot and Lowe's because they have a long track record of using neonicotinoids and pesticides in the production of their plants. And this is sort of one of the cruelest ironies, that you seek out a native plant with all the intentions of supporting pollinators, only to unwittingly be poisoning the very thing that you're looking to support. So you know enough to stay away from those. And so I think, okay, well, where else would I go? I want to support my local garden center, my local independent nursery. Many of these are family-owned businesses that have been communities for long periods of time, and most certainly deserve your financial support and patronage. So many of them are marketed by this group, which is an amalgamation of some of the largest commercial nurseries in the East and the Midwest. And one of their products that they're pushing is this worry-free collections. So if you look at the fine print, they're selling non-invasive barberries and non-invasive miscanthus grasses. Both of these have been banned by state authorities in many, many states, at least in the East, because they escape and they are ecologically harmful in natural areas. But don't worry, everybody. Finally, the problem of invasiveness has been solved in the landscape. Oh, what a relief. What was I doing beforehand, before the worry-free collections came along? This is really confusing. Why grow this? Why produce sterile cultivars, or supposedly sterile cultivars, of a plant when you have so many better options out here? Because it is viewed entirely through a lens of landscape performance for you as the human and no one else. So I find this to be worrisome, not just worry-free. Lastly, we'll talk about the sale of regulated plants. And so University of Massachusetts did a great online survey of garden centers and online retailers across the country, and found that many of them were still offering for sale ecologically harmful plants, and ones that we know we shouldn't be selling anymore. And nearly every state that had respondents had at least one regulated plant that was sold in a nearby state. So very little is done to regulate the fact that you can go across the state line and purchase a plant that is banned for sale for good reason and bring it back over into your state. The picture here is of Callery pear. And those who know about Callery pear know that this was heavily promoted in the eastern part of the United States as a street tree, and it sort of sat there for about 10 years, and everybody thought it was the perfect tree, despite some of the structural deficiencies that it has. And then it started showing up en masse in natural areas. And it is, I think, now in 42 of the 50 states of the United States. So what do you do with all this information? You have a landscape that has a lot of choice. You go to any particular garden center, and there's lots of different plants with weird names. You just don't know how to make sense of all of it. And so I like to sort of use scientific research as a guide for my decision making. And there, as you probably might suspect, there hasn't been a whole lot of research to date about this question, the sort of, are cultivars as good as species? How do I make sense of it? Is it bad to use cultivars? That's all I have available. So I'm going to go through some of the different current research that's here and help kind of unpack. But I just wanted to say that the real answer here is it depends, or yes and. So let's take a look. So first and foremost, I think we need more transparency around how plants are grown. So traditionally, you can grow things from seed, which usually means that you have some degree of genetic diversity there in the resulting progeny, or you can grow them asexually, either as cuttings, grafted material, or tissue cultures. Most of the nursery industry now favors the growing of things through cuttings because it's faster and it's more efficient. But you're putting out plants that are all genetically the same. And I think you're doing the plants a disservice by not giving them their own tools to be able to adapt. If you know your plant is patented, then it has to be a clone. All right, so that's another key piece you can look for. But sometimes it's hard to find that information. Because I have I'm interested in the subject, you can look through plant patent applications, and you can learn a lot about how they were done, what the parents were, and get some ideas, because oftentimes the name that is registered under the plant patent is not the name that they use when they're marketing. More confusion. Some selections come true from seed. Some of them are just, a particular form of the plant that a keen-eyed gardener and propagator saw out in the wild and collected seed, and it stays true. And there's nothing wrong with those ones. Self-incompatibility is an interesting kind of side discussion, in that what that means is it means that a plant is unable to produce seed by itself. So it's self-incompatible. And this is something that has been documented to have arose throughout plant evolution multiple times in multiple lineages of plants. Phlox is one of those that is self-incompatible. We've planted at Garden in the Woods a huge quantity of woodland phlox in a cultivar that's all genetically the same. And in the nearly 7 years of working in that space, I have never seen a single seed produced. So I asked the question, how is this plant going to adapt to an uncertain future if it can't even make seeds? So really what you need to know is provenance information and more transparency around how plants were produced. Where you garden is also important in terms of context. This study looked at two sort of extreme different contexts, one that was small, isolated, highly disturbed, more urban sites, and compared that with larger sites that were generally less disturbed and closer to in proximity to natural areas and remnant populations. And they assessed a number of different species and cultivars for their performance and suitability. Not surprisingly, very few of the cultivars received high scores for use in areas that were close to parks and natural lands and more undisturbed lands, whereas over half of the cultivars had great scores in those smaller, isolated, and disturbed areas. The idea being, if you're worried about gene flow and so forth, there's less of a concern in an urban area. Plus, a lot of cultivars, if you remember going back to our discussion around consumer preference, were bred for compactness. If you have a small garden, if you're trying to do containers, use a cultivar. They are great for that reason, and you should feel empowered that you're doing something positive, even if it's a cultivar, as opposed to a plant that might not sustain as many ecological relationships. So that really has context really matters, and I think it's where, given in certain contexts, using a cultivar is the right choice. In others, if you can find species and locally adapted species, it would be a better choice. Now, a quarter of them had some altered trait that compromised its ability to support wildlife. And I'll get to that, what that is specifically in a minute. But what they suggest, of course, we need more research. What I would really love to see are plant breeders that are breeding for ecosystem function in mind. Where are the cultivars that are producing more pollen or higher quality nectar or greater volumes of nectar? We're still too focused on pretty and not enough on ecological function. This is the thing, that we live in a time where we're asking successful gardens to perform a dual purpose. All right. They need to be aesthetically beautiful because that helps us engage with nature. We want to see beauty and flower and texture and color because it's a wonderful way that we connect with nature and we deepen those relationships. But we also ask plants now and gardens increasingly to be ecologically functioning, and you can do both. So another study looking at insect herbivory. So these are the insects that eat plants to survive. And this could be beetles, like our little dog-bane beetles here, or caterpillars of moths and butterflies that need hosts. And they evaluated natives and cultivars and found that the only negative change that came was when foliage color had been altered to red, purple, or blue. So knowing this, I tend to avoid cultivars and selections where the leaves have been selected for maroon or purple, because all of the insects that would normally eat those don't find them more palatable. They can't eat it anymore. That doesn't provide the same food that they had before. It didn't matter if it was short or tall, if it had bigger fruit, enhanced fall color, disease resistance, variegation. None of that seemed to matter in terms of the ability of those plants to support insect herbivory, only if it was negatively changed to red and purple. So when we start to change flowers, the color, the size, the timing of flowers, we're doing so again through the lens of this is pretty, bigger, better, and we don't know what we're doing to quality of pollen and nectar. That these are the things that sustain our pollinators. And these changes really tend to impact specialists, which require the presence of certain plants on the landscape more than generalists. And as I said before, 4,000 bees in North America, of which a quarter of them are pollen or nectar specialists. So Dr. Annie White did this research up in University of Vermont and evaluated species and cultivars for pollinator visitation and preference. In general, pollinators prefer the species. There were exceptions like this Veronicastrum here. In general, the more highly manipulated cultivars were, the less attractive they are. The same holds true for hybrids and certain breeding programs. So a lot of the Baptisia, Twilight series, similarly, because they don't look anything like the parents anymore, the pollinators were confused. The recommendations are, stick with open pollinated seed-grown selections if you can, and avoid the hybrids and cultivars that differ significantly from the species. Another study evaluated how native and non-native pollinator friendly, so plants that are marketed as pollinator friendly, how do they interact with wild bees? And so they put these together in a couple different ones. Not surprisingly, honeybees were higher frequency over the non-native plants, but there were some generalist bees, like carpenter bees, that were more abundant on the native ones. And again, not surprising, specialists far more abundant in the native plots than in the non-native ones. Their conclusions: it's okay to mix together non-native plants with natives as long as they're complemented with known native pollinator-friendly plants. So again, there's a little bit of context here. It's not bad to have these things, but also make sure that you have a good amount of natives included. The last study that I'll look at here looks at floral abundance and insect visitation. So we know that many of the cultivars are selected to have bigger flowers and to have flowers that last for a longer period of time. And this was a study done in Florida. So non-native ornamentals produced on average twice as many flowers over the natives. In some cases, for example, the coreopsis here was 5.5 times larger than the species, the lantana 5 times as large. And so, as you might expect, the insects are drawn to better advertising. So in the end, there really wasn't that much of a difference in between the ability for the natives and the non-natives to attract different groups of generalists. Now, flower and nectar isn't just sugar. We know that it is a source of energy, but it's also packed with lots of other things. There's wonderful examples of bees getting buzzed on caffeine that's in the nectar, and it has them coming back to the flower again and again and again. There are mind-altering compounds in the terms of alkaloids. There are important proteins and lipids that are found in nectar and pollen that are really crucial for insects to be able to be reproductively successful. Excuse me. So the second part of the study was to evaluate the resource value of these groups. So the species Salvia, for example, which is a red tubular-shaped flower, had the largest nectar volume in summer, not surprisingly because it's hummingbird pollinated, all right? But once the hummingbirds leave to go somewhere else, that large nectar volume switches to another plant. Composites, not surprisingly, had the lowest nectar volume. However, some of them had the highest pollen protein and pollen viability. So again, it shows that there are some non-native ornamentals that provide resource-rich floral rewards comparable to the native ones, but still they're saying here you should take care not to make similar assessments of other floral types. So I'm going to skip over this one, but it's essentially the same that, bees, the native bees preferred the species over. There were a few examples, and I really wish we were all in a big room right now so that I could pause and I could look out over the audience right now and I could say, how many of you are confused right now? I think it's okay to be confused because this is a complicated subject. And there's different advice here that says, yes, in some cases, the natives are better. In other cases, the non-natives were better at supporting things. You really don't know, and we need more research right now. So I'll leave you at the end with some takeaways that I hope will help to kind of crystallize and condense the message here. But don't feel bad about being a little bit at sea, because many people are. I think one of the biggest things that we encounter at Garden in the Woods frequently, people are worried that they're going to do it wrong, or that they're going to make mistakes. And I'm here to tell you that every single professional gardener and plant expert has made loads of mistakes. It's how you learn from those mistakes that makes you a better gardener. And so lean into those and experiment and try. I mean, the message is welcome a native plant into your garden and see what happens. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. Last subject here on science before we wrap things up. We're doing a study with Vermont Center for Eco Studies and Ecosystem Studies now, evaluating whether pollinators have a preference for ecotype. And we're growing all these plants together, and we've sourced them from the Southeast, from the Midwest, and the Northeast. And we're trying to see whether the local pollinators up here in the Northeast prefer the Northeastern ecotypes over others. And we'll be excited to publish some of that research when it's ready in a couple of years. So our own nursery here, which is not a plug for us, this is really more just so you can see that what it looks like when you grow everything from seed. We have lots of really wonderful little seedling trays, and but we're a small staff. You know, I have 3 full-time folks out there, and this is one of the bigger issues with native plant nurseries. While there are far more available and starting now than there were 10 years ago, they're still small, they're still relatively niche, and it's really hard to compete with those bigger guys that I talked about a little bit earlier. For folks in the Northeast, we do have a great resource called Garden Plant Finder, which gives you not only cultural information, but also ecoregional information, habitat, companion plantings, what kind of wildlife each species supports, and we continue to add and build out to that every year. So here's the big wrap up. Regionalism is really defined by these approaches, and so they're maintenance practices, but it also is a way to try to favor seed-grown local provenance plants if you have them available. Having native plant cultivars are good choices too. Think of them contextually. If you have a smaller space you're working on, perhaps the compact selection is just better for you than a taller one that might flop or might be too aggressive. The idea at the very top here of aiming for about 70% or 2/3 native plants is supported through research from Dr. Talamy and others that has indicated this is a really critical threshold to reach that will sustain a diversity of insect populations and bird populations and other kinds of life if you can get to that threshold. Now, everybody's at a different journey. I have learned long ago that you don't make any friends by garden shaming. And I'm not here to tell you that you're doing it wrong or that you made bad choices before. This is a movement that is very positive. It is very forward thinking. And is again going back to those 2 motivators of hope and agency, that we're looking to build a brighter future where our choices in gardens help sustain healthy and viable populations of diverse life around us, because we all benefit from that. So choosing the right plants is part of it. Planning to have floral resources throughout as much of the season. And if that means that, like for me right now, I have some Korean chrysanthemums that are still in bloom now, and they're fantastic. And I know they're not ecologically harmful, and I don't feel bad about having them in my garden because they really bookend the season beautifully. Providing shelter and nesting, leaving some earth bare so that you can really welcome the cavity nesters and the ground nesting pollinators. Leaving it a little bit messy is also good. Obviously, and this should be without saying, avoid using pesticides. We don't need them anymore in our landscapes, and they do more harm than they do good. Leave the leaves. There's been some really wonderful articles and resources out there about all of the life that overwinters in leaf litter. So if that's where a reality of where you are, accept that free gift from Mother Nature and from the trees, and honor that gift by letting it lay where you can, and letting it do its job and supporting all that life. And lastly, ask questions, share your knowledge, share your passion. As Donna said at the very beginning, this is now also a social movement as much as it is a movement to build connected corridors of habitat. So do so by share seeds, share plants. This is all the way that we bring more and more people into the fold here. So your choices really do matter. And with that, I will say thank you. Also happy to share any of the citations if anybody here is interested in some of the research. And please feel free to contact me here, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Well, I learned a lot. I work with this stuff day in and day out. And Uli, this was fantastic. So thank you so much. We have a bunch of questions. And let me see. I'll just start from the top. So someone is asking, my big problem is knowing what is native where she lives or he. Do I stay with what is local to my county? Is there some defined region? Is it state? Are there websites to help with this? And then they ask about native cultivars. I know you've talked a lot about this, but the comment is it seems like an oxymoron to me. So what is native to any one particular spot? I think is a really good question.
So um, I think that we have to be a little flexible in how we define native because we live in a rapidly changing landscape. Traditionally, what has been considered native in any one particular region is defined by a technical flora and a manual that has said that we have records of these plants existing here in herbariums, and many of the authors of these floras have personally seen the plants out on the landscape, and therefore they define it as being native. I think that the going by like county or state boundaries is going to be difficult because again, the plants and the way that they're distributed don't recognize our political delineations. I find the ecoregion concept to be really much more informative. So I would suggest that the listener go to the EPA ecoregion, specifically level 3, has just enough granularity. The big map that I showed when I introduced the concept of regionalism was the least granular one. But this will show you wherever you are what ecoregion you're in, and you can try to source plants from within that ecoregion. And that will also help you define what you think is native. Another approach is to try to find, wildflower guides for your state. These are also really wonderful ones that are state or region, for example, that can help reveal to you some of the diversity that is of where you live. The disconnect, of course, will unfortunately be trying to find some of those beautiful images in real life in nursery. So the the cultivar question. So plants have long hybridized with one another if they're compatible and if their ranges overlap. And there's lots of documented examples of this. A cultivated plant or a selection is one in which humans have had a hand in creating. So we have intentionally introduced things that may or may not have met in the wild. Sometimes we've introduced things from North America and from Asia together and bred something looking for specific characters and then putting a name on it because there's ultimately a financial inspiration for doing this, and then putting it out on the market. So, you could say, well, every plant is native to somewhere, and there is some truth to that statement. But we're really trying to give people resources to learn more about what naturally occurs within where they are, and sort of start with that and work your way out and see what you can bring into your garden that's already within that region.
Kind of a follow-up question here from a different person. Why use ecoregions alone? The author of the original ecoregions at the EPA has written that the development of ecoregions did not take into account individual species of plants or the effects of urbanization and suburbanization.
Yes. Well, I mean, and this is a valid point. And so some I don't know of a different approach that puts together, um, like I said, plant community type geology, hydrology, keeping in mind that the more urban you are, the more those systems have been impacted and disrupted. Um, so I think that it's a useful way to define it. And I'll also say that so some of the ecoregions, um, particularly in the East Coast, span large geographic areas from north to south. And so, how do you make sense of something of a region that might, have a finger that goes all the way down into Virginia? Does that mean that I should be, is it okay to source plants from Virginia? Um, I have a friend of mine who takes plant hardiness zones and overlaps that with ecoregions. And so you work within your hardiness zone and within your ecoregion. That helps define it into, more or less a box that you can work in that reflects the climate that you're in and the conditions that you're in. So the, uh, uh, um, average climate conditions and how the plants that have evolved in that are representative of an ecoregion. The last thing I'll say is that um, it's true. Plants don't all neatly line up along the boundaries of these kind of amorphous blobs that we show on a map. There are some plants that are distributed across many ecoregions. So take like common milkweed, for example, that is widely distributed across most of the continental United States and is present in at least 30 different ecoregions. On the flip side of that, there are plants that are only found within a particular ecoregion. So things like coastal species. If you garden near the ocean in some way or another, you're looking at things that are salt tolerant, and they're largely not going to be found particularly far inland. And so the ecoregions that hug the coastlines are also a good guide for what might be appropriate if you were building a garden on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, or in Florida, or Cape Cod, or somewhere on the California coast.
A little bit different question. How close do residential native plant gardens need to be to really make any kind of difference? That is, will insects travel a block, for instance?
Absolutely. Some will travel over a mile. Others are very hyperlocal. Some of the smaller solitary nesting and specialist bees have a pretty limited range, assuming that their preferred plant or required plant is there. Others will be able to travel much larger distances. Moths and butterflies, as monarchs are capable of spectacular migrations. Others are capable of flying, dozens of miles within a season. So I don't think you have to necessarily. I mean, we're talking about creating habitat for a broad range of organisms, from ones that are really hyper local that might have a range of a quarter mile or less, and also welcome and incorporating organisms that are able to fly across multiple states.
So what we say is just talk to your neighbor, lean across that fence and say, look what I just planted. Why don't you plant one too? And then you don't have to worry about it, right? And then you get to meet your neighbor.
Yeah.
So lots of reasons to,
If you share some seed or propagate,
yeah,
say, hey, like I saw you really like this. Would you like to?
yeah, good. Um, how do you remove exotic weedy plants without using herbicides? Being from the deep south, I am defending our biodiversity by fighting invasive plants. Weed wrenches and similar approaches are too labor intensive, and I'm using the cut stump herbicide method very successfully on bush honeysuckle and privet.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, there's another approach that involves cutting and then putting a very thick black bag over the stump, and that tree will try to sprout into the bag and exhaust itself. Um, I think that herbicides are an important toolkit in the fight against ecologically harmful plants. And they have to be used in a really targeted way, in a very judicious way, and especially after you've tried to exhaust other methods. So we oftentimes are the first thing that we reach to, but I think there are, you know, People use goats, they use sheep, I mean, there's other ways. There are physical controls. If you're willing to play the long game, some will disappear if you can create shade, for example. And this has also been a successfully employed method, particularly for sort of full sun sorts of plant, ecological harmful species. Over the course of a couple decades, you can really um, I've also heard of folks like repeatedly cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting, which has its own sort of labor intensity to it. Um, but it's not quite as, and I can appreciate my wife's from Tennessee, so I know how hot those summers can get. And I can imagine sweating it out with a weed wrench is not a particularly attractive option. Um, but I think there are other options that are out there. There are non-toxic products in terms of herbicides that you can try. And in some cases, after you've tried everything else, um, doing it in a really targeted way and making sure there's a minimal zero collateral damage is the only option to be successful.
Here's an interesting question. Are the harmful species, in quotes, that multiply so quickly not dependent upon insect or animal pollination?
They are, and I mean this is actually a really great question
Yeah, it is. It's
uh,
interesting.
because those harmful plants that have come from other places are not devoid of interactions with the insects and with the birds and so forth that are here. Um, I've seen plenty of lectures for gardening for birds who promote the use of any plant that produces berries as being good for birds because they've seen a flock of birds descending on honeysuckle bush from somewhere else and devouring what's there. Um, I think you have to think of it as you get more relationships with native plants. It doesn't mean you don't get any with the ecologically harmful plants that are there. They just don't support the specialists or the breadth of diversity that we need to make sure it doesn't disappear. Um, so, yes, many of them rely on not only insects for pollination, but birds and other mammals to distribute and disperse the fruit. And they also really rely on a sort of disturbance regime that we create. We create a lot of disturbed habitat, a lot of edge habitat where birds want to hang out in a tree and then, they drop off a little seed fertilizer and off you go. So it is that it's not like they're devoid of interactions, um, but put it sort of contextualize it and think that you get a lot more by welcoming natives over those ecologically harmful ones. I should also add that many of these plants were intentionally introduced by the horticulture industry in the last 100 years. So horticulture actually bears quite a large degree of responsibility for the fact that many of these plants are here. Privet, burning bush, kudzu, uh, bush honeysuckles, all you name it. There's a story that goes back to somebody bringing a plant from somewhere else in the world, thinking it was beautiful or had great landscape performance, planting it, and then it escapes.
What are some good sources for investigating whether a non-native is likely to be ecologically harmful?
Hmm. Um, this is also a great question because sometimes it's not immediately apparent. There's a fairly well documented lag period in which um, something is introduced and then it sort of sits there for a number of years, sometimes up to 10 years, before there's some subtle shift in the ecosystem that allows it to then really start showing up. There's a wonderful researcher at the University of Tennessee named Daniel Simberloff, who has published a lot about biological invasions and has really studied how this happens. The irony of it is that there's a curve along which when things get introduced, And at the bottom of the curve is when eradication is most likely, but most people don't know about it. And by the time the public becomes available of it, it's so well established that you've now shifted away from eradication because it costs too much money. And now you're into the realm of trying to control it or keep it at bay. And that has mixed results. So, if anything, having more field botanists and more people out there looking and saying, "Hey, I saw this thing showed up in out in the wild, and I don't know what it is." That kind of information can be crucial in terms of being able to stop the next invasion.
There's lots of great questions here. I don't know how much longer you want to go on, really, but why don't we do one more and then we'll use you as a guide whether we want to keep going or not. So the next question is, native plants are increasingly grown in public demonstration gardens that may welcome seed harvesting, but the provenance may not be clear. If we can observe pollinator activity on the parent, is that a good indicator that the plants offer good ecological value, or at least good enough? Is responsible seed harvesting a good alternative to buying plants? Which sounds so problematic.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm oftentimes struck by the, a well-worn statement that not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so I think that if you're seeing pollinator activity, then you can pretty well assume that the plant is doing its job and offering resources. Um, I think that there is an underlying sort of moral and ethic to seed harvesting that many folks either don't understand or don't honor. And what it boils down to is that you should never take more than 20% of seed from any given plant. And the reason for that is that you want to make sure that the plant it has means to be able to seed, pass on adaptations to the next generation. You don't want to harm it in service of being greedy and taking seed for it. Oftentimes, people also will collect from only the biggest, strongest one. And I think that's also, best protocols say sample from as many individuals. The one that looks weaker or maybe not as floriferous, maybe more drought tolerant, might be more disease tolerant. You don't know, but you don't want to overlook it just in favor of what you think is biggest and prettiest. The last thing I would say is that permission is a really important thing when it comes to seed harvesting. And I want to draw the line between harvesting and foraging. Again, we're not looking at either public plantings or public spaces as a place to profit from or to fill your plate. They can all be done responsibly, honorably, and ethically. And there's lots of great resources, grading sweetgrass, start there, or Robin Wall Kimmerer's other book, The Serviceberry, is all about the honorable harvest. If you can go by those guidelines, then I think you'll be in good shape. Let's do two more questions, and then
Okay, well, the next one actually got the people working behind the scenes said there were multiple people that asked this next question. So you're going to kill lots of birds with one stone if that's a bad analogy. But many people asked why poor soil is a gift.
Thank you for noticing. That I put that in there because it's sort of like the worm on the end of a hook, and I want to see how many people bite. So we have a tradition in this country with land grant colleges and extension services providing us information about soil and soil fertility, oftentimes through the lens of agriculture. You want to know how best to grow your own tomatoes, peppers, whatever it may be. You send in your soil, and they will happily give you a recommendation to add lime, add organic matter, add this and that. Many native plants um, have actually evolved to grow in relatively poor soils. Um, there are numbers of examples of natural plant communities that are called barrens. And they're called barrens not because they're devoid of life, but because we failed to grow traditional agricultural crops on them because of the paucity of the soil. But they actually harbor some of the most unique and biodiverse plant communities in the country. So poor soils are a gift in the sense that, you are unlikely to permanently change the nature and soil profile that you have, even if you add compost on top every year. Um, in the end, you would have to add a lot of it in order to make any kind of permanent changes. It is financially costly to bring in soil amendments. It is labor intensive. So, along with the idea of like the right plant for the right place, think of poor soils as an opportunity to create a garden planting that is unlike anything your neighbors have, that you can populate with some really cool and unique plants that will love your conditions without you having to do a whole lot to the soil to make it successful. So I put that in there because if you have those conditions, it's an opportunity. It's not a curse. But we're still thought of, we think of soil and soil amendments through this agricultural lens. And even though a lot of extension services are now slowly beginning to kind of work into giving advice about natural soils or natural plantings in soils, many of them still have the same playbook that they've had for the last 150 years, which is I will give you advice on how to grow lawn and how to grow edibles. And that doesn't necessarily mean success for growing.
Interesting. Another question or request that has come up from numerous people is about getting access or a link to the density, the gradient maps, again, the density grading maps. People would like to get some statistics for their particular counties.
Yes.
And so where could they get that information, those links?
Those maps came from a really wonderful program called the Biota of North America program. The acronym is called BONAP, BOAP. So if you do an internet search for BONAP, you'll land on their homepage, and they have all kinds of wonderful maps, specialty maps. You can have maps of family diversity. You can go all the way, if you know a particular plant that you're interested in, you can find a map of the distribution of that plant in the United States. Really good resource. The other one that I would recommend for county level information is the USDA plants database. It's still functioning despite the shutdown, because I was just on it the other day. And they also have range maps for particular plants and species, and you can zoom in and click on it, and it will give you, if it's available, county level distribution data. So you'll know with good confidence whether or not something is naturally found in the county.
Yes, sir. Uli, this has been fantastic. We have more questions, and I'm sorry we could go on for probably way longer than your wife would want you to go on. So I'm going to say thank you. I'm sorry we didn't get to all these questions, but the amount of information was more than most of us can take in, and we need to chew on all this stuff anyway. So thank you so much. Thank you everybody for coming. We had a tremendous response. This will be on YouTube. We'll have a link to the recording, and you can watch it over and over again. And I guess get in touch with the Native Plant Trust to have a visit if you're in Massachusetts. And know that that resource is there and so valuable. So thank you, Uli, and thank you everybody for coming. Thanks.
Thank you all.